We just implemented a stale-while-revalidate strategy. It allowed us to display an application's shell very quickly and independently of internet connection. But this strategy also introduced a delay before we can update an application to a new version. Let's try to improve this strategy a little more. Currently, we always display a cached version of an application's shell, and we fetch a new version only to update the cache, so that we could see this new version later. But can we use this fresh version immediately without delaying it until next time? In case of static files, this may be tricky to implement. Let's imagine that we displayed a page using a cached HTML file. Then we receive a new HTML file from the network. And it turns out that the markup in this file is different from what was rendered before. Can we change the markup of the page on the fly? Technically it's possible, but in most cases it will be really crazy. Let's think how it may look like, just to play around. First, let's use async await, because otherwise this code will quickly turn into a terrible mess. Now I want to take this HTML response and just re-render the page completely. First I need to get an HTML text from this response, using a text method. But before that I have to clone this response, otherwise it won't be possible to use it later in the code. Then I take this HTML text and assign it to the body inner HTML. It's crazy, but I am just playing around here. And of course we want to do all this only if the intercepted request is a navigation request, I mean a request for the page itself. Now the code looks nice, but it doesn't work. There is no document in a service worker, and it has absolutely no access to the DOM. We may assign something to the inner HTML only within a main JavaScript application. And in this case, we will do this when the main application receives a message from a service worker. And the service worker has to send this message. He can do this by calling a postMessage method on a client object. But of course he has to first find this client, a window that made this fetch request. For that, a service worker may check a client ID from a fetch event. That's how we normally do it, but unfortunately it's more complicated when it comes to the navigation request. For such requests, a client will always be undefined. That's why in case of a navigation request, we'll have to send a message to all clients. Now I expect that in a short while after the page loads, its contents will be replaced by something new. And let's add a timeout to make it more visible. Here we still have an old version that gave us a document undefined. Let's refresh and we'll see the same error and the same old code. We successfully downloaded the new service worker, and it tried to update the cache with new static files. But a fetch request from a service worker was intercepted by HTTP cache, and that's why we still have the old files. In this situation, I should ideally fix my caching headers or add hashes to my file names, but I am too lazy, so I'll just disable the cache and kill the service worker to download everything again. Hit refresh. A new service worker was just activated, and this time it managed to get through the browser cache and fetch fresh files, including a new JavaScript that is now waiting to update the inner HTML. This didn't happen yet because on this page load, a request for that HTML file happened before the service worker was activated. But next time it should work. Cool, it's something new. Now let's send the fresh HTML with this message. And use this HTML instead of a hard-coded text. After refresh, the new service worker was installed and the new application shell was cached. But the page and all its requests are still controlled by an old service worker. I have to click Skip Waiting to activate the new one. As I said before, it's not so easy to replace a service worker, but let's discuss this later. Refresh again. This time something new didn't appear after 2 seconds, and that's okay because it hopefully means that we have the new JavaScript application running. After 2 seconds we have a message that contains a string with all the HTML text. So it works fine, but let's change something in the HTML file to make sure that these changes are immediately sent to the main application and reflected on the page. For example, let's add a border to a picture. And this border in theory has to appear after 2 seconds. Hit refresh. 2 seconds. Yellow border. Great. Now let's forget about this solution, because anyway in real life reassigning the inner HTML will likely produce a shocking effect on the user. Updating the content on the fly is possible, but it makes more sense for a content that updates frequently, not the application shell. In Offline Cookbook, this strategy is called cached in network, and it's meant to be used for something like articles, social media timelines, and leaderboards. The implementation is radically different from my code, but the idea is mostly the same. A service worker does almost nothing in this strategy. It only updates the cache with fresh data. All the interesting stuff happens in the main application. It goes to the cache and to the network at the same time and updates the page whenever it gets a response from any of these two sources. Again, this strategy is more suitable for data rather than static files, and Offline Cookbook emphasizes this fact in the code. But I think we can still do something useful in a situation when an old application shell is already shown, but we suddenly discover that there was an update. It would be insane to just replace an old shell, but at least we can notify a user about a new version and explain that he can see it after refresh. Let's try to implement this idea. Now we don't send the HTML text with the message. We just notify the main application that something has changed. We want to compare the fresh HTML text with the cached one, and send the message to the main application only if the HTML text is different. We also have to clone this response to prevent exceptions. The main application will show a button to refresh a page whenever it gets a message from a service worker. In a short while, we have the new code activated and running. Now let's change the HTML to make sure that this update is detected and the button is displayed. I'll change the color, for example. Hit refresh. 2 seconds, a button comes out. Click the button, the page is reloaded with a new color. So the code works as expected, and now the user has a greater chance to see the new version quickly. But we are interested in updates to any files of an application shell, not only HTML file. So we will try to send a message not on navigation, but if the request URL belongs to the list of the application shell files. This is just an idea of how it should look like. For now, this condition will always be false, because the request URL will be a full URL, not this relative path. So in practice the code will be more complex, but for now let's stick to the main idea. So how does this strategy perform in this table? It's mostly identical to Stale-while-revalidate, but with a small improvement. Now we give a hint to a user that he can get a new version immediately. Basically, I like this strategy because it seems useful, it's relatively safe, and quite easy to implement. It renders the application's shell quickly, without connection, and significantly mitigates the problem of stale content. This notification button may be a problem because it's yet another distraction for a user. But if it looks fine in your particular case, then you definitely can use this strategy without sacrificing the freshness of your site.